Welcome to Redefine the Circle, a podcast where we discuss all things pitching. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. In this podcast, we're going to highlight topics that focus on how to maximize your pitchers now. We're going to discuss some of the trends that we've seen at S2 Breakthrough and talk about how we use data to create systems and training approaches that are specific to each pitcher. It's so important for us to continue to share this information and facilitate discussion within the pitching community so we can keep evolving as coaches and ultimately grow pitching into something it's never been before. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for joining the quest to redefine the circle. Hi everyone, welcome back to Redefine the Circle. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development here at S2 Breakthrough. We are kicking off Series 5 today, and this series is all about roots versus symptoms in regards to biomechanics. What really inspired this series and these discussions is a lot of the pitchers that we work with here at S2 Breakthrough. They come here, and I think one of the number one pieces that really is just so powerful and provides them with so much information or answers regarding their story is when we really talk about the types of things that they are seeing or have known about their motion regarding positions they get into, maybe issues they have with where their stride leg is going, where their arm path looks like. And when we actually sit down with them and talk to them about the root, something that we hear a lot from pitchers is they'll say something like, I've been working on fixing that for so long and nothing seems to work. So I think a really powerful story is to really explain to them why just how the body moves, how the body operates generally, meaning that the levers, meaning neck position, arm path, legs, the levers are at the mercy of the trunk. And I have said that in previous episodes and in previous series. We've talked about this concept quite a bit, but what's so important to understand is that the trunk, meaning the center of the body, the pelvis and the chest, its ability to stabilize, its ability to rotate well, is really the key. It is the root of what allows pitchers to be efficient, allows them to transfer energy well. And to the extent that the trunk is not able to really hold that stability, is not able to stay in good position, is not able to rotate well, then we start to see the levers be used as strategies. So the brain, the body is incredibly smart. It knows that it needs to accomplish a particular task. It knows what sort of has to be done. It will seek what it needs through the levers if the trunk is not holding up its end of the deal. And so in order to actually fix a lever's position, it's very important to understand why is it getting into that position in the first place. So when we talk to pitchers and they say things like, I've been doing a lot of drills for this, and the drills are typically centered around just fixing the lever. And so it's important to understand that when you attack a strategy, sort of the pitcher's strategy for to make up for what the trunk is not doing, all you're doing is because you're not really attacking the root issue, what's going on with the trunk, is you're going to force that pitcher to have to maybe get rid of the strategy she's using, but she's just going to trade it for another strategy. And so we're going to be on this merry-go-round, as I usually say. We're not actually going to make significant change when it comes to whatever we're building, like being able to put her in a better position from a health standpoint, gain velocity, gain break. When we're really trying to tackle those goals, and we feel as if in order to reach those goals, we have to attack the way in which the pitcher is moving in the motion. It's very, very important that we understand roots versus symptoms. And so in each one of these episodes in Series 5, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just tackle one sort of very typical sort of strategy, or one thing that I think catches our eyes as pitching coaches, parents, pitchers ourselves in video. So what's important to note is that video itself really is typically only shows us lever positions, or I should say lever positions are the things that are what are visible to our eye. And so for us here at S2 Breakthrough, when we're doing the biomechanics assessment, that portion of the assessment, I should say, when we really want to look at the root issue and why levers are getting the positions that they are, then we rely on biomechanics data. And so in this series and in today's episode, I'm going to pull up some graphs, some biomechanics graphs using 4D Motion Sports. These are wearable sensors that give us reads, quantitative reads of what's happening in each of these examples that I'm going to give in each of these pictures. So I would like sort of the purpose of today's episode and really of this series as a whole is to start to understand, okay, when my eye sees X, what I know is that likely, even if I don't have biomechanics to work with, I don't really see anything quantitative that's really going to tell me about what's going on with the trunk. I know that when X is happening, likely it's related to the root cause of Y. And that's really what we want to get to here. There's no doubt about it. We've collected biomechanics data on hundreds of pictures, and no two pictures are exactly the same. But basically, root breakdowns, trunk breakdowns early in the motion, there's only so many things that essentially can go wrong. It's what makes pictures unique are the strategies in which they use once the trunk has broken down. And then whether or not there's multiple strategies, there's one strategy, whether or not those strategies end up being something that actually helps their ball flight data, whether it's something that hinders their ball flight data. We'll talk about things like that in future episodes, but every pitcher's body sort of relies on different strategies. There's no two pitchers that do the same. And so in today's specific episode, I'm actually going to talk about arm path. That is the sort of central example that I want to give today. When we see arm path issues, what is happening with the trunk that typically sends the arm in the wrong direction or on the wrong path? We've had a lot of discussions before, primarily last summer when Laura and I launched an educational series. We talked a lot about arm path issues, and arm path issues, we just were really, when we started to go down this route of collecting a lot of data and biomechanics, we're really taken aback by how many pitchers have arm path issues, and as a result, really have limited lat mobility, are not able to get their arm overhead with full length, because what we've seen a lot is that in their motion, their trunk position forces the arm to sort of get in a compromised position. And then that arm position they're in the motion basically starts to become their neutral, starts to impact their actual mobility. So, arm path issues and lat mobility challenges are discussions that we have a lot of information out there. That educational series still lives in our Stream S2 platform for those of you who have not seen it. But today specifically, what I really want to talk about is what are sort of some of the most common arm path issues we see in the motion. I'm going to go through some high-speed video for us to look at that. And then let's look at the 4D analysis to show what's actually happening with the trunk that's causing the arm to do that. So let's go ahead and glance over here at my screen. This is going to be the first example that I'm going to go through. And in this example specifically, what I'm going to show as I get this pitcher going through her motion is that here is a very common thing that we see when arm path can become an issue. And so what you can see here is that this pitcher is really, you can see it with the eye, but is really going to be like a very open, essentially. Like her body wants to rotate really, really early and aggressively. And because of that, look what happens to her arm path. We can see right away the arm will bend, and we don't see this normal long arm path in a great direction, the normal sort of windmill. So arm path gets compromised, gets away from the body. Certainly the elbow bends. And what I want to talk about as I scroll over here is what do we see before that arm path actually bent? Now, in this particular example, maybe her body position was a little bit more visible to the eye. But let me show you what we are seeing as a very, very common thing that's happening here with the trunk that forces the arm to have to bend. So this is 4D. Before I get started, let me give a little bit of an intro. Also, for those of you, this is your first experience looking at 4D graphs. Also, I have tons of episodes where we go through things like this. Also in Stream S2, I have a couple videos where I just kind of go through in detail, like what are we looking at? This is all raw data and raw graphs, and what information is it giving me? Those would be great. Also platforms and great examples to go back to just to sort of get a baseline knowledge. But today, just to sort of catch all of the listeners and viewers up, we're looking at a graph of the trunk. So we have the pelvis here on the left and the chest here on the right, and each of them has the three planes of movement in rotation, the forward and back or sagittal plane, and then the side bend or hiking plane here in blue. And so without going through the details of every part of this graph, what I want to show is that when we get this picture to the end of the launch phase, which we're going to identify as like when her arms get extended to the target, this is something that we see fairly often at S2 Breakthrough. Pitching is all about timing. It's whether or not what's happening with the trunk regarding rotation and stripe of contact and where the arm is in relation to those events, if that is syncing up, basically to allow the energy that we got from the ground to transfer efficiently from the body to the arm. So to the extent that we're not on time, even if we are in an upright posture and even if we're rotating well, but we're not on time between trunk and arm, there's going to be energy leaks, and there are going to be things that sort of are breaks, or like as I said, leaks in the kinetic chain that just decrease efficiency. So in this example, taking my eyes back to the screen, when we get to the end of the launch phase, what we see here is that this picture, if we look at rotation of the pelvis over here on the bottom left, she's at 85 degrees already. That would be like a lot for a max rotation. So a couple of things we usually see at the end of launch phase here. Usually we're about 50 to 60 degrees. Let's assume a pitcher is getting to about 75 to 90 degrees at max when she gets to the top of her arm circle. So we're seeing pitchers accomplish about 50 to 60 of that by the end of the launch phase. So right away, you can see basically this pitcher just flew into rotation. She was almost at her complete max by the time she got to the end of her launch phase, and we can see that here by this 84 degrees. When I swipe back over, this was the period of time that I showed here. You can see if we had a side view of this pitcher, like her pelvis, her hips are already almost totally facing sideways. So this is a timing issue. This essentially can kind of break it down to simple terms, is if the pitcher sort of like skipped a step. Rather than being at only about 45 to 60 degrees of rotation, she flew right into almost her max rotation at this point. So in order for the body to try to catch up, remember, if the name of the game is about syncing up the timing between trunk and arm, if we know that essentially that is off, then what this pitcher's arm is going to do in order to speed itself up and catch up with timing is that it's going to shorten. And so the quickest way to sort of make the arm faster is for the lever to shorten. And so that's why we see this elbow bend. That is why essentially this becomes a strategy. This is a very, very common thing that we see here at S2 Breakthrough. But I want to really note, to the extent that you are working with a pitcher or you are a pitcher, where you know that something you see in your motion very clearly is that the elbow bends and the arm path becomes compromised. Absolutely, we want to stay away from doing things where we're just like focusing on the arm circle. Like an example would be like getting on your knee, on one knee, and just focusing on the arm path, getting up against a wall and focusing on a straight arm path. It's not about the arm as if it lives in a silo and it's just doing that for the sake of doing that. That's the strategy to get on time. This series of Redefine the Circle is sponsored by 4D Motion Sports, the most powerful, portable, and affordable motion capture system. 4D motion sensors are used by the world's top sports professionals, and it's incredibly exciting to now have them for softball hitting and pitching. At S2 Breakthrough, every one of our athletes begins with an assessment process, which includes a biomechanics analysis using 4D motion sensors. The data is collected and available to read within seconds. It provides us with key metrics such as trunk stability, trunk rotation, as well as the timing and sequencing between the trunk and the arm. This is critical data for athletes and coaches to fully understand a pitcher's story and appropriately identify the root inefficiencies in her motion. The ability to fully maximize pitching performance metrics starts with understanding biomechanics, and there's not a more accessible and efficient way to quantify that story than through 4D motion sports. Again, future episodes in next series, I'm going to talk a lot about when strategies, sort of hinder ball flight data, and sometimes when they actually promote better ball flight data. That's a complicated conversation. I will talk about that in our next series. But what's important to note is that if this is the strategy to get on time, if you then take that away, you might be making that pitcher worse. Meaning you might essentially, if she's doing something different with her arm, but her trunk is still over rotating, they're out of sync, they're not in time, and then velocity plummets or whatever that might be, if this strategy was successful in getting her into good trunk arm timing. So that's really, really important to note, that when the arm is in a poor position, it is not because it's doing it on its own. It is because of what we just saw, taking our eyes back to the screen, in something that's going on with the trunk. And this is just one example of something that we see, is this early rotation. There's a variety of reasons why this happens. Sometimes it just happens because a pitcher has really poor sort of stability and rotational stability while in the air. So as soon as she launches, she loses control of the pelvis. Sometimes it's because she was really limited in the amount of force she put into the ground, and we saw this early sort of turn, and that automatically sent her. There's a variety of reasons why this happens. So you could argue that that's sort of like the actual root, but focusing on here, what we see in the trunk data, in these trunk graphs, is really this over rotation forces the arm to have to bend. And you have to understand that those two go hand in hand. Okay, let's take a look at another example. Let's take a look at the video to start. Here's another example of when we see some arm path issues with pitchers. And this is, instead of the arm sort of bending and getting sort of like crossing over the midline here, what we see here is an example of a pitcher where the arm is really far outside of the body. This is just one example. I've also seen examples where I've seen pitchers have like a really straight arm path and it goes like out to the side. But basically when the arm gets sent out further, so instead of going toward the target, it gets kind of sent for a right-handed pitcher like further to the right, and then obviously to the left for a left-handed pitcher. But why is this happening? Again, we do not want to just attack the arm path. We don't want to put this pitcher on one knee and talk about moving her arm in a circle. This is happening because the trunk is forcing it to go in this direction. So why? What is happening here? Here's the 4D graphs, and I should have started with this. For each of these videos, this 4D graph actually matches. It is the same picture on the exact same day. And so this is what we see with this picture. And again, this is something that as a theme we see often. So for this picture, if you watch, as she gets into her launch phase, what we'd like to see, these big bell curves in green are the load phase. And when a pitcher then comes out of the load and into the launch, when her arms get extended to the target, what we typically like to see is that the green is right at 0 for both pelvis and chest. So about 0 degrees here at the end of launch. And what that shows us is that her posture is nice and neutral. So stacked posture, upright posture, however you think about that, she's in good neutral posture. With this picture, what we see here is that her pelvis data, it never got out of anterior tilt, so sort of like the hips pushing back behind her. You can see here she's still at about 10 degrees. She never returned to that 0 baseline. And similarly, we can see here that the chest was in this flex position for load, and instead of getting to neutral and stopping, it continued through extension and hyperextensions, which is why we see her green graph all the way here below 0. So she has hips going in one direction and chest kind of pulling in the other direction. This is an anterior core concept. So essentially, whenever we have pitchers whose anterior core is a real challenge for them in the motion, that when they launch, they don't know how to put the brakes on to stop the launch phase. And instead, the body just keeps pushing past the neutral posture. Essentially, the arms go with the anterior core and then start to get really wide and get away from the body. This is super, super common. We will talk about glove arm in a later episode here. This is particularly the throwing arm path that we're talking about today. But the glove arm is going to be a very similar concept. To the extent that we're losing anterior core in the motion, the glove arm will go with it. But again, for the sake of today's discussion, let's talk about that throwing arm specifically. So we can see that. Another way, I'm going to sort of just move forward, and this is the same picture, just a different graph. This is going to be a graph of trunk rotation. So this is all just a rotation. The red is pelvis, the green is chest, and the difference between them is in blue. And really what the difference is when we start to change direction. And so when a pitcher is applying the brakes in the appropriate timing, remember, pitching is all about timing, we would see that this peak blue graph, so this is a behind view of this avatar, but this peak blue graph when the pitcher changes directions would occur when she's at the end of this launch phase, which is here. And you can see this is not happening. Instead, it takes her much longer. So the degree at which we hit the peak of that blue when she's well past that launch phase, basically when she's overhead, means that she is in the anterior core did not break in time and tell her to start changing direction. So any time in these 4D graphs, we see that this peak in blue is very late regarding when the pitcher should be changing direction. That is going to sync up with what we just showed earlier, which is going to be really poor posture, what I would call like hyperextension through launch. And you'll see for this pitcher, it's only going to get magnified as she goes to the top of the arm circle. So even looking at this avatar, you can see she's in this peak loss of posture here with pelvis and with chest as she's all the way here at the bottom, and then look at that arm path really far away from the body. So when I return to that here in the video, we can see that. We can see just how far away from the body she actually gets. Now, does she recover from this? How does this ultimately affect her? That's something that I want to cover in future episodes, really in next series, to talk about when pitchers have strategies to sort of get away with energy leaks and when they don't. And we will look at those in detail because that really, is a complicated story. But for now, really what I want the base of today's discussion to be is just to understand, yes, your eye will see the levers. Your eye from video will see glove arm. It will see stride foot landing. It will see arm path of the throwing arm, but we cannot just create drills about those levers. We have to understand that the body works from proximal to distal, meaning the trunk is what's in charge of telling the levers what direction to go in, what path to stay on, when to rotate. And so just again, understanding that we have to go back one step further to understand that trunk. I'm going to show one more example here. So let me keep rolling. And this is an example that we see a lot as well. So these are all arm path issues. And these, I want to just sort of explain the root issue of what we see when the arm does these things. And so as this pitcher launches, what we can see here is that the arm is going to cross over the body, sort of like in front of the face. And this is going to lead to compromised arm position. Again, let's not just assume that just because arm path gets compromised, that this means that this pitcher is not effective or successful. I just want to point out, when we see things like arm path, what are the things that are going on before it? So let's take a look at this pitcher's 4D graph when we're looking at the trunk. So this is an example. So remember the first example that I gave, it was about over rotating. That created a timing issue. It was as if basically we skipped a step and just immediately flew into rotation, which caused the arm to bend. In this example, which is one we see often, as I'm getting this pitcher going, it's going to be the opposite as we saw in example 1. When we get her to the end of this launch phase here, what we're going to see is that normally we see again about, basically around 55, 60 degrees of rotation here in the pelvis. And for this pitcher, she's just going to be a little shy. We're usually looking at about 30 degrees here in the chest. And so to the degree that which she's under rotating, this would look like a pitcher who just goes forward at launch. So there's been no sort of initial unraveling or rotation introduced in the motion between load and launch. And so as the arm tries to go over the body, go overhead, I should say, there's really no space for it to do so. And so if everything is forward at the end of launch, then as we now try to generate rotation, what usually happens for these pitchers is that they go into extension and then the arm follows the path of the upper body as they go into extension to now create some rotation. So basically, when we're talking about ideal and most efficient patterns, we're looking at things where as we launch, we unleash a little bit of rotation and then we maximize it as the arm goes overhead. So the degree that which we fly to max, there's a timing issue. The degree that which we go into our launch and everything is forward and there's no rotation, there's also a timing issue. And so we have to make up for the rotation we didn't unleash. And typically that's the strategy. Chest opens up, goes into extension, and then arm path crosses over, which is what we saw in that video. So these are just 3 examples. Are these absolutely the only 3 examples that we ever see? No, but they're very much the 3 common ones. This early rotation or excessive rotation early, this sort of anti-rotation when we're talking about transitioning from load to launch. And in the second example, which we gave, would be just such a loss, an extreme or severe loss of anterior core that as the chest went into extension, the arms obviously got sent off path. And so, as you can see here, these are just really, again, the arms are kind of doing different things. It's possible that essentially, the arm path does one thing, like the roots are the same across pitchers, but their arms do different things. Like I said, everybody's strategies are different, but typically this arm path that I'm talking about is paired. So this anti-rotation leads to the crossing over in front of the face. The early rotation leads to just an elbow bend to get the arm around shorter. And then again, in that second example, the arm kind of going out to the side because of anterior core. Those are typically linked. So what I would really encourage you to do is, again, even if you don't have the means to actually take data and quantify what's happening with the trunk, understand that when you see that, that is likely what's happening early on in the motion. And there's other things, like I said, roots underneath of that, like what's going on. For us, is anterior core, let's talk about example number 2. Is anterior core a real issue for this pitcher? Meaning, when we look at her movement assessment, was she really severe in anterior core? If the answer to that is no, or anterior core actually held up really well outside of the motion, we really need to sit down and talk about how to attack and the types of movements and prep work and drills we want to do in pitching that get her to activate that anterior core. Sometimes pitchers have issues with with like intent, they think that because we've really taught things like this for a long time, that launch is about getting as big as possible, getting out as far as possible, as high as possible. And so it blows up their brakes, essentially. They bust beyond their brakes, which is a phrase I use a lot. And so then there are times, obviously, where we see that a pitcher's anterior core is severely is a severe issue, essentially, that it broke down really easily in our assessment process, our movement assessment. And then we'll talk about, the intent and how we want to really activate anterior core. And we'll give you things here in our prep work to help you feel that. But the reality is the real root of this sits underneath of pitching. It's your ability to build the anterior core. So there's always sort of another layer, if that makes sense, to roots versus symptoms. But just looking at today and this whole series, this roots versus symptoms concept regarding levers versus trunk. When it comes to video, what the eye typically sees is lever position. And what's very important to note is that the levers do not just do things on their own. When the trunk is doing exactly as it's supposed to, the levers don't go rogue on their own, is what I'm trying to get at. They're linked to what is happening the step before it, typically in this load to launch phase. That's really where we start to see those breakdowns. So what I just want to sort of put in everyone's head as we're starting to work through these 5 episodes in series 5 is that, when you see someone who has less than optimal positioning, the first thing that you want to talk about first thing we really need to sort of establish is that doesn't mean we have to go make everyone's positions look optimal. There's a lot of things that go into that. This is really what I'd like to dedicate the next series into talking about. Like, there are times where someone does something really less than optimal, but the way in which they recover from that gives them ball flight data that really is special. And we'll talk about those, like I said, in next series. And so it doesn't always mean that we're trying to make everyone's positions look more optimal, but to the degree that which maybe we have established that someone's positioning is really holding them back from a velo standpoint, from a health standpoint, from a break standpoint, and we do need to make change, then what we absolutely have to get away from is creating drills that simply address levers. That is not respecting the fact that the body is a kinetic chain. That is as if, we're really like, sometimes I'll see drills where people are just like keeping the body stagnant and just forcing the arm to do something. We have to get away as a pitching community from doing things where we take the body out of it or we keep the body still and just have the arm work as if it's living on its own. That does not happen. I've said this in some previous episodes, but typically what we see is that the arm is usually doing as much as it possibly can. Like, it's not, when people aren't achieving spin, it's not a wrist snap concept. It's not the fact that they're not getting in position, or like their arm doesn't know how to get in that position. It's because the trunk position isn't allowing them to access that. So really just want to drive that concept home. The levers get into the positions that they can because they are basically trying to salvage the motion because of what the trunk did not do, how it broke down, and basically how it was, the ways in which it sort of stopped contributing to the ability to stabilize, rotate, and transfer energy. So again, today's episode, just about that arm path. So keep that in mind as you're watching some video of your pitchers and you're talking about maybe how to get them in better positioning. Go back one extra step and think about what is the trunk breakdown that's linked to an arm path like this. Following the following 4 episodes of this series, we're going to take another. So again, just like we did arm path today, I'm going to take another example next week and just talk about here the types of things our eye usually sees on video and show some sort of quantitative trunk data to really link it to, what puts pitchers in this position in the first place. So that when we start working with pitchers, we have an idea of how to actually attack the root. Hopefully this was a helpful discussion. Appreciate all of you for watching and listening. As always, whenever I'm using some of these visuals, particularly with this 4D data in this series, really encourage all of you to check out the Redefine the Circle YouTube channel to make sure that you're following along with all of the data. Between today and next episode, remember to keep questing on to redefine the circle. Thanks, everyone. See you next week. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I'd love to connect and hear your feedback. You can contact me directly at ashley@s2breakthrough.com. If you're listening, you can leave us a review, or if you're watching, go ahead and leave a comment below. Also, be sure to follow S2 Breakthrough on all of our social media channels and subscribe to Stream S2 to find all things player development. Until next time, quest on.